a sustainability scientist, and I've been applying over the last 20 years sustainability principles to healthcare, prior to that to agriculture and environmental issues. So you will see that we will be taking a fairly strongly ecological approach, because we as human beings are engaging in an ecological system from which we are largely disconnected. So it won't be a surprise to many of you that we're in the midst of an environmental crisis. Sometimes it's defined as a climate change crisis. It could equally be perhaps better described as the 6th mass extinction, but it depends what part of the problem you want to focus on. And the reason I'm showing you this is because if we apply a big enough lens to the problem and appreciate the multifactorial nature of the problems we face, we can actually find solutions. Some of the difficulty, one of the reasons I think we can probably realistically say the era has been one of the great successes of education, information over the last 20 years. We are at the end, we hope, of the pill for an ill era in medicine, because we understand that most of the burdens on health are complex. They cannot be achieved by blocking particular pathways. What we need to be doing is moving to a world where we start facilitating processes. So when we look at the environment, we can look at all these facets, from the level of habitat destruction. We can look at climate change as a part of it, but we can also see climate change as a pollution problem in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, which is no different from the problem of persistent organic pollutants, for example, that seems to be fairly low on people's list, despite the fact that's causing major problems. But when we move into looking at the problems with the human race, one of many millions of species, we see that there are strong relationships between the crisis that we endure, which is down to the destruction of the terrain. We've had over 2 years now of dealing with a new virus, and we've really been looking at solutions that are about using a technology that is designed to upregulate the immune system that hasn't worked particularly well. There's been very little consideration of the terrain that ultimately defines how successful we will be in dealing with a new pathogen. So if we look again at what is happening with diversity, we have a major problem with the declining diversity in terms of the commensal bacteria and microorganisms that we live alongside. Some of them that used to be commensal becoming pathogenic because we see a disturbance in those communities. We see a big change in the overall terrain. We see massive toxic load problems. We see uncharted problems around EMF disturbance that we still cannot really fathom the extent to which that's an important reason. And of course, we have a whole bunch of human challenges. Ultimately, a stable system is one that is complex, that has many, many feedback loops within it. This is how human metabolism works. We have at least 135 very well described pathways, and many of the problems we see is in chronic and degenerative diseases, but also even the way in which we respond to infectious diseases is about disturbances to these systems. So rainforests and coral reefs are the most complex system we know about. Human beings, there's not a single technology that can improve the function of those systems. They work incredibly well without human engagement. And of course, as a result, we've been hearing today how important it is for the body to be the teacher, but nature really is the ultimate teacher. The more we can understand about this, and of course, the more we can recognize that there are still many areas of medicine and science that are largely uncharted. So we look at the effects of biofields, the area of bioenergy medicine that's really just beginning to emerge. This is a new dawn. I mean, it's a new dawn, but yet it's an old dawn, because if you look at all the great cultures, they dealt with much more with the metaphysical. And so as we have replaced many of these diverse whole systems with technologies, we've become ever more narrow, and it's not working very well. So bottom line is, when we look at nature as a teacher, we can understand that within that system, communication, I talked about feedback processes, communication is absolutely essential. So we think of plants as slow animals at best, but most people think of them as almost inanimate. But yet they have all the senses that we have. They can communicate, they can feel, they can smell, they can speak, and they can communicate through the mycorrhizal fungi in the soil. They can communicate through allele chemicals that are released into the air that communicate and cry for help to other insects. So they don't just communicate within their own species, they communicate outside of those. And just think about this for a minute. When we think how poor we are, not only at communicating with our own species, but in the field of medicine, we have disciplines of medicine, modalities of medicine that cannot speak to each other because they're so hyper-specialized. And often they use a language that isn't exchangeable. So when we start to look at solutions, we really have to deal with this issue of communication because we're dealing with an ecological environment ultimately. So, yes. So a common language, if we're going to look at solutions, is absolutely at the heart of it. The other thing that we see, and of course functional medicine has become the discipline of medicine that's really put this in the forefront. We need, if we're going to look at health and the regeneration of health, we have to look at function more than at disease. If we drive a motor car, we see an orange light or red light on the dashboard when there is going to be a problem with function. The oil light goes on because there's not enough oil, and if you don't replace that oil, the engine overheats and breaks down and strands you on the side of the M25, for example. But we don't have a system that measures function very well, particularly not between the different modalities. We have a whole array of issues that we need to be pretty realistic about. If we want to solve problems, we always have to define the problem. And so what I've done here is just raise 10 different areas. We could have chosen 15 or 20, but PowerPoint doesn't allow us the landscape to do that. But hyper-specialization, this idea of going into a discipline, for example, where endocrinologists don't talk with immunologists. Thankfully, those two groups of specialists are beginning to talk. But we don't necessarily see a lot going on between neuroscientists and gastroenterologists, despite the fact that we know the 10th cranial nerve through the vagal connection has this incredibly important communication. So we're not dealing with the whole system. We see this ignorance, this denial of ancient cultures, yet these were the cultures that understood the mind, body, spirit connection that to some sounds quite trite, but actually all the science is pointing to the fact that we are more than just a bunch of cells that are communicating, and that the science of biology, chemistry, and physics only quite partially explains life. There is much more to it now, and a lot of people are thinking, well, now we're into molecular biology, and we understand the genome, and we're sequencing every single, organism on the planet. We understand everything. But we don't understand very much, for example, about the 98% of the human genome that appears to be non-functional, that actually probably is quite functional, that has specific effects. And when we engage in GMO, we're actually playing with elements of life that we don't fully understand. And so we've got a long way to go. But there's corruption, there's the fact that the entire system is largely reactive. We largely in mainstream medicine do things once we've seen the vehicle of the human body break down or start to express clinical disease. We can't hide away from the fact that the system is very corrupt. Most of the peer-reviewed literature that influences the choices that a medical doctor makes when they prescribe drugs is the result of paid-for scientists and paid-for science. We've got to not hide this reality. The subject of this conference is about personalization. We've seen in the last 2 or 3 years a backward step in terms of this duality between the increased personalization and individualization of medicine to this one-size-fits-all public health routine that does not work very well. We've seen a particular virus that seems to be very good at exploiting the weaknesses in the terrain, yet we've done very little to amend the terrain. So then there's issues of health data ownership and all the rest of it. I need to move on. And I am struggling to advance the slides. Thank you. So this is just an example of the issue we face. On the x-axis here is a lifespan, and typically we are applying most of the healthcare effort very late in someone's life. It is a reactive system that really kicks off once we see clinical manifestation, pathogenesis. And of course, it's not sustainable. And we've seen sustainability applied to so many industries, from agriculture to energy, even to tourism, but why not in healthcare? So if we're going to do it in healthcare, we have to have a proactive system that works over an entire lifespan. And that, as we know because of epigenetics, means even starting before the time of birth. So salutogenesis, health creation, is really what we need to engage with. In a perfect world, we'd all live to 100 years and we'd drop dead, or 85 years, which is the average age in most industrialized countries. The reality is what we're seeing is a disturbing change to the survival curve, where more and more people are spending more and more of their latter lifespan, in other words, they have reduced health span, in a morbid state. And we're starting to see now kids developing what we used to think of as chronic disease, type 2 diabetes. We are seeing a massive shift in autism, to the point that by 2030, many estimates suggest that in the Western world, between 1 and 2 and 1 and 3 children will be diagnosed with, will be somewhere on the spectrum. When we look at the systems that you have the opportunity to use, they're all quite imperfect in many respects. So the mainstream system, you go and see a primary care physician, which is a great idea, to see a generalist that is able to triage you into the system. Where it perhaps goes wrong is that the generalist is generally working within tram lines that are set down by organizations like NICE, and it often results in, I am struggling with the advance here, with prescription of medications, the use of increasing use of injections, and then you may be referred to a specialist, to a consultant, if things are not working out, but they are still working within their individual silos. So many people say, well, here's the alternative. In countries like the UK, obviously it's privately funded. One of the things we do know about it is that people who make this option will often self-care to a much greater extent, because the reality is that any improvement in health for someone that is diseased occurs because of self-healing. So what we're really doing is facilitating an environment that encourages self-healing. The downside is that you then are thrown into this chasm with all these specialists, be them osteopaths, chiropractors, nutritionists, craniosacral therapists, etc., all of which are speaking different languages, and you haven't necessarily been triaged. So the chiropractor may not be great at determining the fact that you've got early stage pancreatic cancer, for example. So we have a lack of metrics, and we certainly have a lack of common language. And how can we find a way of making these systems work for the individual? So there's a bunch of things that we need. We need to look upstream at the individual. We need to look at the overall ecology. It needs to be holistic and whole person. It needs to be sustainable. We need a common language. It needs to be bottom up, not top down. We need connection at every level. It needs to be health-centric rather than disease-centric, and it needs to be participatory and collaborative. Sound easy? Only 10 things to do. So this is really what our blueprint has been about. We've been working on it for over a decade. I've got 5 minutes left. In essence, it's about how you make transformative systemic changes to the system to apply sustainability principles. Right at the heart, there's one thing you take away. It's about how we can use a common language to understand what is happening during someone's health journey. And essentially uses 3 different lenses: evolution, ecology, and systems biology. And it understands the importance of epigenetics, which is the way in which the environment changes gene expression. Part of this language is a thing that we call the ecological terrain. And we've been looking at many different ways of describing these 12 domains of function. We have isolated a whole range of biomedical tests that can determine function. Testing has come of age, but testing is not for everyone, and it's certainly not going to deal with people in disadvantaged groups who cannot afford private testing. So we've also been looking at proxies that are zero cost to look at the function of these 12 different domains. We even give them different domains. We also have seen this massive change, loss, subversion of bioethics particularly over the last 20 or 30 years, and especially over the last 3 years. So we need to develop a new code of bioethical practice that works for all clinicians who engage in sustainable systems. And these are some of the outlines. There's plenty more on our website that you can look it up. Now, this is really the key slide that takes you through the journey of how it works. So the aim is to build resilience and self-healing capacity in individuals and communities, and either take them through a process of self-caring or to use a common language that takes them to health guides. Understand that doctors, practitioners, health coaches, physical therapists are people who guide someone in this health self-healing journey. But they need to work with that common language. So we've developed a way of an outer onion skin, if you like, for the ecological terrain. It just works through mind, body, spirit, and environment. It can be quantified into percentage terms so that people understand which area is dysfunctional. More importantly, you can then, I'm working with the advanced, look at the ecological terrain. So we're developing a digital platform so that people can work with it, so the individual is in control of their own health and can then communicate with any practitioner, understanding with which one they can connect to depending on which area, which domain is suboptimal. And if they need to seek guidance, they can go to health guides from any modality, be it mainstream, be it alternative, that are able to work at restoring function. So that's the essence. How do we get there? And I know I have to finish. Collaboration, absolutely at the heart of this. So trying to help bring together, this is not something that exists just in alternative medicine or just in allopathic medicine. This is about using a natural selection system. One of the things you will notice is that we're not talking about delivering interventions. The healthcare professionals do that themselves. What this is a system of assessment that self-selects those systems that work for the individual and for communities. So it's about collaboration, it's very much about education, and it's also about demonstration. We were going to be moving prior to COVID to a kind of research phase. We are now hearing that more and more practitioners are ready to start implementing these systems. So we're really in the digital platform construction phase. There are many people in different parts of the world who are feeling this is the right time. We're off on Friday to Brazil, where there's a conference with 15,000 people that we're going to be presenting this to, 15,000 medics who are coming together, all catalyzed by the fact that COVID provides the opportunity to do something differently. So on that note, I'm going to say thank you very much and open to questions. Thank you.